Well, welcome to the Working with Reports in Evergreen Introduction and Setup webinar. This year, I'm going to be doing a series of webinars on the reporter. We did have a lot of requests, both for introductory level report work, as well as training and more advanced topics. And so my plan this year is to start at the beginning and gradually build on that throughout the year. So today we are going to be starting at the very beginning. If you have worked with reports before, you may still find some stuff of value in here. We're going to be talking a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts of what's going on underneath the hood in the reporter. So hopefully you get a little bit out of that, as well as maybe some tips and tricks that you had not come across before. We will also, for those of you who are brand new to reports, hopefully get you started. So I do recommend that if you are able, that you go ahead and have Evergreen up in a window where you can actually do a little bit of work with it, because there will be some opportunities for you to follow along if you're able to. So today we are going to be talking about a little bit about what's new in the reporter since our upgrade last November. We'll be spending some time with the centralized reports templates and how to navigate those and kind of search for existing templates that you may be able to work from. We'll be talking a little bit about adding new display fields and filters to existing reports that you may clone. And then we'll go through the process of actually getting a report to run. So for those of you who are able to follow along in Evergreen, by the end of today's session, hopefully you will have successfully run a report. We'll also talk a little bit about some troubleshooting and some of the common issues that people come across and some different things that you might be able to do to kind of fix those issues as you go. I do encourage you to bring any questions that you may have into the chat, and we will try to get to those as much as possible today. And otherwise, we'll go ahead and get started. So the reports workflow is basically from start to finish, the full process of developing a template for a report, running that report, and accessing the output. When we're talking about sort of introductory level reports work, typically you won't be doing too much of the development of those templates from scratch. So today we're really going to be talking about the workflow from the perspective of finding and cloning existing reports. Those of you who have worked with the reporter before are familiar with the concept of the three-step process of reports. Those of you who are new to it, it's basically a process of developing a template, running a report off of that template, and accessing the output. Each of those steps does have specific things that need to be done within the step in order to be successful at getting a report. The template, though, is probably the hardest step. And so that is the part that is easiest to sort of borrow from others. And that's what we'll be talking about mostly today. But the template is where you basically select the fields that you'd like to display in your output, select how you'd like to filter those fields, determine what the data in those fields will look like once the output has been created, and then determine how the filters will actually choose what types of data to include. This is followed by the report step. So a lot of people who are new to the reporter, one of the things that they maybe find to be a little bit of a steep learning curve is the concept that you build your template, but you can't actually get any output from the template itself. You have to do a second step, which is actually setting that report up to run. Once you're used to reports, that becomes fairly standard, kind of second nature, but it's a little bit of a tricky concept to get started with. But the report phase is basically where you set the data that you plan to filter on. So in that template, you develop the fields that you want to filter on, but in the report, you actually set the values for what those filters look for. So for example, in a template, you might say that you want to filter on checkout date. In the report step, you'll actually determine what dates you'll be looking at. So you may say in a report that you run that you want to look at all checkouts from September 1st to September 7th. And then that's what we'll actually filter. But in the template, you're not setting those dates. You're just saying, I'm going to set a date range. And then you can run reports off of that same template multiple times simply by changing those dates. So one of the things about the report step is that you can run the same, or you can run different reports off of the same template. You can also, at this point, you'll develop what you want your output to look like. So you'll name it, and you'll also determine what type of output you want. Do you want an Excel file? Do you want a CSV file? Do you just want to view it in the browser? And you can also set up whether or not that's going to be a recurring report. And we'll talk a little bit about recurrence later today, but recurrence basically means that you run the same report on a regular basis. And if there are dates involved in that report, then those dates will change based on when it's running. And that's something that we'll talk about quite a bit when we talk about running reports later this afternoon. The final, before we move on to the final step, why are templates and reports separate in the Evergreen Reporter? The template basically asks the question, what data should be pulled? And the report answers that question. So when you set up your template, you basically set up the question of which dates do I want to include in this output, or which call numbers or which shelving locations. When you set up the report to run, you answer that. You say, I want the dates from August 1st through September 1st, or I want the shelving location, adult fiction and adult nonfiction. And so you set whatever those answers are at that second point. And this allows those templates to be fairly reusable and fairly generic. So for example, if you're doing like inventory templates and you want to run a different report for each different shelving location in your library, you can create one template for that. And then you can run 8 or 9 different reports where you are specifying which shelving location should be included in that report. Does that make sense? All right. So the final step to the reporter, to that 3-tiered system, is the output itself. And so this really, to some people, it may not feel like a step in that it's just the result of everything. But when you are setting up your reports account for the first time, you do have to do some setup for the output. So it's important to think of this as its own distinct step, because this is where you'll be viewing the data. Now, most NC Cardinal staff, I feel like, do view their data from an email that they receive when they set up the report. So you would get that email and then you can click on a link within the email to access the data or the output. But you can also access it from the reporter in Evergreen directly from an output folder there. So there are definitely 2 different ways that you can access your output. There are multiple different formats for output. The 3 big ones would be HTML or browser-based, so you can actually look just directly within your Evergreen account, or 2 downloadable options in an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV file. Now, an Excel spreadsheet for most of you is going to be your #1 choice, because of course, once you have it in that spreadsheet, you can do everything that you would normally do with data in Excel. So you can change the sort order, you can do formulas, you can break it up into different chunks and print only a little bit at a time. You can work with it as you would any other spreadsheet. However, a CSV file is also really useful, because if you are running a report for the purpose of finding data that you will then re-upload into Evergreen for any reason, so for example, a list of barcodes that you're going to upload into the item status screen, a CSV file is the format that you'd need to save it in. So it's helpful to download it in that file to begin with. And when we run a report, you'll kind of see what those options look like. The other thing that the output view provides is it provides something called debugging information. And this is very code heavy and doesn't actually make a lot of sense just to look at. But if something goes wrong in your report and you need some help, one of the best ways to get that help is to send that debugging information to somebody on the Cardinal team. Putting in a ticket with access to the debugging code is a great way for us to kind of figure out what the reporter was trying to do and why that didn't work, which does happen quite a lot. So, you know, it's sometimes the reporter's a little bit mysterious, and that's okay. So the debugging information is really helpful when you need help trying to figure out what went wrong with the report. So that is the 3 tiers of getting reports going. Basically, you create your template, you run a report off of that template, and then you access your output. And one of the things that you'll do as you are working through these stages is you'll set up folders. So that's the first thing that we're going to do. And if you do have Evergreen open, then I would recommend that you follow along with this step, especially if you've never worked in the reporter before, because this step is vital to being able to run reports. If you have not done the initial setup, then you won't be able to run any reports. The initial setup is basically just creating subfolders for each of those 3 steps. So you'll create a template subfolder, a report subfolder, and an output subfolder. And you can create as many of these as you want. You can have just one and keep everything together. If you run a lot of reports, then you may find that you want to have more than one folder for these different areas, just so that you can kind of stay organized. So you may have one folder for circulation templates and another one for item templates. And that's really up to you in terms of your organizational method. But you do need to have at least one for each of the 3 tiers. So let's go ahead and look at how to do that. So I am going to be from the reporter. Or from Evergreen, I'm going to go up here to the administration menu, and I'm going to choose reports. And this is what the reporter looks like when you first get into it. And what you want to do is come over here to this section that says My Folders. And you'll click on each of these 3 top level folders in order to create a new subfolder. So I'm going to start with templates. I'll just click on the template link. And if you are able to, I encourage you to follow along with this step. And when I click on that, I get this button here to add a top level template folder. So I'll click that button, and all I have to do is create a name for that folder. And now if I open up this templates folder by clicking on this little caret here to the left, then I'll see webinar now shows up here at the bottom. Now I have a lot of folders because I run a lot of reports. You do not have to have this many. You can have only one if that works for you. You can have many folders and keep just one report in each folder. So again, just kind of up to you and how you'd like to organize it. You do have the option of creating subfolders within your subfolders. So if you look here at this shared reports folder, I have a little caret next to it, which means that if I open this up, this is where I have even further subfolders down from this one folder. So you can create multiple layers as well if that works for you. I'll go ahead and close templates, and now I'll follow the same step for reports, where I'll click on reports. I'll click the button to add a top level folder. Now Evergreen will automatically fill in the name of my reports folder with the same thing that I had set for my template folder. I can keep that, especially if I'm doing something where I'm setting up, my circulation reports. And so I want that folder to be consistently named across all 3 sections. Or I can name this something new. So I could call this webinar reports. And again, if I open up the reports folder, Jamie asked if the folders are shareable, and they are. I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. It's pretty straightforward. And in fact, you can see those that I have shared are the ones that have in parentheses next to the name, the level to which they are shared. So you can share at your branch, at your full system, or with all of Cardinal. Unfortunately, you can't choose to share it with just one other library. So you can't decide that you want to share it with, a different system within NC Cardinal, but not the rest of NC Cardinal. It's either your branch, your system, or the entire consortium. You're getting an error message when trying to use the same name. That is very odd. That's not something I've run into before, but let me try that. So I've used the same name for templates. I used webinar, and it does look like that's working. Jamie, if you want to take a screenshot of the error message you're getting and try to pop that in chat, that might help. because I don't think I've seen an error message like that before. But so that would be, now we've done our templates and our reports. Our final one would be outputs. So again, I'd click on outputs. I'd click add top level output folder, and then I can enter a new name or just go with the default name it's giving me. And when I expand my outputs folder, now I see webinar is here at the bottom. Now I can go into these subfolders that I've created by clicking on them. And of course, there's nothing here. I haven't created anything for any of these folders yet, but throughout today, we will be filling these up a bit. Okay, so it looks like the error was based in where you were within the interface. Oh, okay. Were you still in templates when you attempted to make your second folder? Yeah, that would, it's pretty loosey-goosey in terms of naming conventions, but it will not let you duplicate names within the same folder. So just something to be aware of. But that's the process of creating your folders. It's fairly straightforward, but you do need to make sure that you've done one for each tier, because if you don't, if you just create a subfolder for templates, you'll be able to make a template. You won't be able to do anything with that template. You won't actually be able to run a report. Same if you created for templates and reports, but nothing for outputs. You can create your template. You can set up your full report, but when you actually go to run it, you won't be able to because there's nowhere for the output to go. And we'll see that process in action when we actually run a report in a few minutes. So just if you have never set up a report before and these folders are completely blank, just go ahead and take a moment to create some subfolders here so that you'll be prepared to run a report in a few minutes. In the meantime, are there any other questions about that folder setup process? All right, so the next thing I wanted to show you was sharing. So we did touch on that briefly. But as I said, these folders can be shared. So you don't have the ability to share an individual report at this time. I think that is on the docket for a future upgrade, not the one we'll be doing in November, but potentially next year or further down the line. That is something that I believe I've heard that some developers are working on. But at this time, you can only share folders. So it is very easy to move templates or reports between folders. So if you wanted to have one folder that's kind of your shared folder that you can just move things into as needed, that's one option in terms of organization. But I'll show you how to set the sharing levels. So you would go into the report or to the folder that you want to share. So in this case, I'm going to share my template folder that I just created. So I'll open up my templates top level folder, and I'll come down here to the subfolder I created today called webinar, and I'll click on it to open it. At this time, there's nothing in it because I haven't created any templates for this folder yet. But what I want to do here is come up here to the share folder button. And when I click on that, the first thing that I need to choose is which level I want to share it with. So as I said, you can share it with your branch, and that's going to be based on the workstation you're logged into, with your entire system, and with all of Cardinal. At this time, there's nothing more nuanced that you can do. So it's not like you can share it with your branch and one other branch in your system. It's either your branch or everybody. And you can't share it with just your system and one other system in NC Cardinal. It's your system or everybody. But, if you are just sharing your templates, not your output, you don't have to worry that any actual data is being shared by doing this. So, there aren't really privacy concerns with creating top level sharing with the templates themselves. And I think most of NC Cardinal staff that works with reports, when they do share things, they tend to share the template more than the report or output level. And so you don't have to share everything if you just want to share the template. Where this is very helpful is as you are getting used to working with reports and you maybe need a little bit of extra help, putting things in a shared folder makes it much easier for members of the NC Cardinal team or even other colleagues who maybe are very proficient with reports who've offered to help to get in and see what you're building with your templates and give advice or troubleshoot. And you can always turn the sharing on and off. So you may start out by not sharing a template folder and then realize you need some help. You can share it with Cardinal, reach out to us, and we can, take a look at the templates that you're creating. And then once we've troubleshot everything, you can turn that sharing off as well. But I'll go ahead and just share this one with Cardinal. And that way, after the webinar today, if you wanted to kind of come back and take another look at the things we build today, you can do that just by coming into the shared folders. So I'll save that and I will show you where you'd be able to find that. So basically up to this point, we've been working in my folders up here at the top. Below that is the shared folders section. So this is where any folders that have been shared with whatever level you are. So if somebody has shared a folder with their branch and you work at their branch, that would become visible to you. If they've shared it with your system and you're at the same system, even in another branch, that would be visible. And then of course, anyone who shared something with all of NC Cardinal would be visible for you. So you would come down here in order to find that webinar folder. You come down here and expand the templates folder in the shared folder section. And you'd look for admin_TRN. Now I am logged in as admin_TRN, so it's not showing up in a shared folder for me, but we'll be spending some time in this admin folder a little bit later today. So it should be right here in this list of admin options, should be underneath admin soup. So you should be able to find it by going in there, and then you would just expand it and look for that webinars folder name. And then you'd be able to see everything that we create today. Any questions about sharing? Right. Well, let's talk about navigating around the reporter a bit. So we just touched on this idea of my folders and shared folders. And shared folders we will be spending some time in today as we talk about the centralized reports templates. The other thing that I wanted to show you in here is search and browse. So if we're in the reporter, you'll see at the top here we have two tabs. We have a browse tab, and that's where we've been working, and we have a search tab. So the browse tab allows you to go into folders and kind of click down until you find what you're looking for. The search tab allows you to search for something specific, and you can select which field you want that specific thing to show up in, whether it's the name or the description, as well as which folders you want to search. So for example, if I want to search things that have been created in the centralized reports templates section, I can do that by kind of selecting that folder level. And then what I'll tell you is that for the most part, when NC Cardinal creates reports that are meant to be shared widely with all NC Cardinal staff, our descriptions are typically follow a very specific format where we name all of the display fields that we include, as well as all of the filters that we include. So knowing that, if you wanted to search within the description field, then you could search for specific display fields that you'd like to see in your output. So if you know that you want your output to include shelving location, then you could type in shelving, specifically searching within description. And then it's going to find everything that is within this folder or any of the subfolders underneath it that has the word shelving in the description. So that's actually a fairly broad search. We do have a lot of reports that involve shelving location, but you'd be able to kind of come over here and browse through until you find something that's what you're looking for. So that's one way that you can kind of poke around to try to find what you're looking for. And I will show you another way in just a few minutes. I will tell you that the search is generally not the first thing that I go to, just because there is so much content in here. And, if I'm looking for something that's a little bit more complicated, like I want a list of all items with less than 5 circulations by shelving location, just searching for shelving location is going to give me such a large list of things that it's going to take me a little while to kind of parse through to find what I want. And I don't have the ability to do a significantly complicated search in here. You know, I don't have the option of looking for, you know, if I try to make it too complicated, I don't get anything. So the search function can be useful if you kind of have a very specific idea of what you're looking for, but the thing you're looking for isn't too specific. But as you get a little bit more complicated in your needs, the search function may be less useful. So just a caveat, you know, it doesn't hurt anything to try a search and see what comes up though. Another thing that I wanted to show you about navigating around the reporter is the ability to work within your grids. So last year in our upgrade, the reporter was completely overhauled to be in what we call the angular interface. Most of Evergreen is in this interface already. So when you see something in Evergreen where there's kind of a grid layout, you have sort of a table of data, and then you can manipulate that table to show you the specific points within that data you want to see. The reporter was put into that format last year. And so now some of those things that you're able to do in other grids, such as in the item status page or, you know, within patron accounts, you can now do in the reporter. And that is especially useful when you're talking about trying to filter down within a folder. So if I go into a folder, and we'll spend some more time in here later, so I'll walk you through the process of getting there in more detail in just a minute. But if I'm in our centralized reports templates and I'm looking at some weeding reports, there are quite a few of them. You know, it's looks like we've got 25 of them. I can filter this down by clicking on this little pyramid menu. So if I come into this description field and I click on the pyramid, I can set a filter for contains, and I can look for any of these 25 reports that have shelving location in that description. And as I said, when we're talking about NC Cardinal created reports, typically speaking, the description is going to include each display field that you'll get in your output, which means if one of those columns you're going to get in that final spreadsheet you download is for shelving location, that'll be included in the description. So I can filter down to only pull up these 7 reports that have shelving location as a display field. So that might be a slightly more efficient way to get down to that type of weeding report that I was looking for, where I couldn't get that complex with my search. But if I know kind of what I'm looking for, I know I'm looking for something that has to do with circulation numbers. So I'm probably trying to do some weeding, finding where the weeding reports are kept, and then using the filter within that folder might be a more efficient way to get to that. You're not going to be searching as broadly as with that search function, but you're able to be slightly more efficient in the way that you're searching. So there's some trade-offs, but just this is the way that I typically will search for things. So personal advice, I guess. In addition to being able to use this filter function, you also, let me remove this filter. You also have the ability to come up here to this little settings menu. And from here, you can manage your columns just the way you do in any other grid. Primarily, that means doing things like adding or removing columns that are showing up within the grid. So one thing I definitely recommend is this template ID column, is turning that on. And just like with other grids, click Save Grid Settings. And that way this column is going to show up every time you come into the reporter. The reason I recommend this is because if you are working with a template and you are struggling with it, as I said earlier, putting it in the shared folder is a really helpful step for getting help from us. Another helpful step is giving us the template ID, because a lot of templates are named the same thing or similar things, or you might create 7 different templates all in an attempt to do the same thing, and we don't know which version to look for. So giving us the template ID is a really helpful way of ensuring that we can get directly to the template that you need help with when you put in a ticket. So just a recommendation for a column to add to your template grid. All right, I think that was basically what I wanted to talk about in terms of navigation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the centralized reports template now. That's the folders that we've kind of touched on a little bit. But before I do that, are there any questions about that sort of general navigation side of things? If you've got any experience with the reporter, you've probably already done quite a bit of this, but if you're brand new to it, feel free to ask any questions that you may have run across. And I'm happy to take a closer look at anything. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the centralized reports templates folder. That is the folder that I was just in. I was in a subfolder within it, but the centralized reports templates folder is a folder and then a set of subfolders that have been created for use by anyone in NC Cardinal, by the NC Cardinal team, that cover a very wide array of potential report needs. It is very possible to come into the folder itself and browse through it. So the way that you get to it, I did it quickly before, I'll slow it down now. You come down here to the shared folders section and you find admin, which for most of you should show up as your second option here. And you expand it by clicking on the little caret. And then you find centralized reports templates. And again, you expand by clicking on the caret. And then you can find all of our different categories. So we have circulation. We do have one on Gale Analytics. We have hold and transit. We have in-house and non-cataloged. We have inventory and weeding, item, patron, acquisitions, billing and payment, and cataloging. Within each of these, with the exception of acquisitions, I think, if you click on the little caret here, you'll expand further and you'll have options of reports that are primarily about counts and reports that are about lists. There are some reports that kind of straddle a little bit of a line between the two, but for the most part, counts means that you are going to get a count of records. So whether that's item records, bib records, patron records, a count of records that fulfill certain categories. So you may get a count of how many items are owned by this branch, shelved in this location, and in a current status of lost. And then you'll get a final column in your output that gives you a count of the total number of items that fit those categories. Lists would be an itemized list of that. So with the same concept, you could have a report where it's going to give you a list of items and it shows the branch, the shelving location, the status of lost, and then the item itself. And so you would get what's included in that count all listed out individually. So for the most part, the templates that you'll find in the counts folders will be those kind of broader counts, and those that are in the list folders will be itemized lists. As I said, there are some things where you're going to get a little bit of a crossover. So maybe you get a count of how many circulations per item. And so it's an itemized list in that it's item by item, but it includes a count in it. For the most part, if there is a count function, it's going to go in the count folder. So just something to be kind of keep an eye out for. But within these folders, I can click on one, and then it's going to just bring me into all of the different templates that have been created by the NC Cardinal team for use by staff all around the consortium. Now, you can go through each of these and browse and use the filter to try to find what you're looking for. Or you can also go to the knowledge books. In the reports knowledge book, Appendix F, you'll get a list of all of the different centralized reports templates that we have. And this list is kept mostly up to date. We update it every few months generally. So, if we ever do add a new template, we'll try to update it. But sometimes there may be a slight lag. But for the most part, we do update it when we add templates. So I'll go into the reports knowledge book. and scroll all the way down here to the appendices and find Appendix F. And so from here, you'll see it's all the same categories as we have within the folder itself. So I could come in here and I could go into circulation templates and counts, and it's going to scroll down and it's going to give me everything that we have. You also get the date that the template was created. Sometimes some of the older templates, just due to upgrades and things like that, might do something funky in cloning. So if you know that it's a little bit of an older template, you can kind of be prepared for that when you clone it. And if you get an issue, you can reach out to us and just let us know about that, and we'll be able to fix it. And that does happen every once in a while where we get a ticket in where it says, I tried to work with this report. This is what happened. It turns out it's just an old version of it. So we just recreate that template to work within the newer version of the reporter. So let's come down here and let's say that this count circulations multi-month is the one that we want. So we can copy this title, and this is when this search function comes in handy, because I can go into my search tab up here at the top. I can put in the title. I don't even need to do all this with like choosing the particular folder or anything, because it's going to take me directly to it. It's so specific, but this will get me straight to what I need. So you can kind of, if it is easier to kind of browse through it within the knowledge book versus within the reporter, you can do that. You can also do a Control F to search for specific things that you're looking for. So just a few different ways that you can find existing templates. Any questions about looking for existing templates? And often what will happen if somebody's kind of new with reports, or they're trying to work on something that's a little more complicated, and they put in a ticket for help with that, we will, if we build a report for you, we'll put it in a specific folder, and we'll let you know kind of the path of how to get to it. So we won't necessarily put it directly into the centralized reports templates folder, because a lot of times those report requests are very specific. But in some cases, it may make its way into the centralized folder. But either way, we'll give you the exact path of how to get to it. So what do you do when you find a template within the centralized reports templates folder? You clone it. And cloning is one of the keys to working with the reporter. So we talked about that kind of three-tiered structure of reports earlier, and this idea that you create a template, you run a report off that template, and then you access the output. When you find an existing template, you need to pull it into that workflow in order to work with it. And the first step of that is to essentially create your own version of that template, your own copy of it that's owned by you, owned within your account. And the way that you do that is through a process called cloning. Now, as you get more comfortable with reports, you may start creating your own templates. And so that is basically a process of creating them from scratch, of going in and making a new template and pulling in all of your data points and then saving it. Cloning allows you to take a pre-existing template, save that template to your account, and then if you need to make any edits to it, you can. If you'd like to change the name of it, you can do anything with it at that point, because it's yours. Once you've cloned something, you own it. And just something that's really important to recognize about cloning is it's not just for when you are working with reports you've found in other accounts. So if you're working with a centralized reports template that you've found, the first step would be to clone it. But if you've created your own template, and the first time you try to run a report off of it, it doesn't work, in order to make changes to that template, you actually have to clone that template and create a new version of it and make your changes to that new cloned version. So those of you who have worked with reports before are probably very familiar with the idea of a template that is a clone of a clone of a clone of a clone. And so that is part of the process of working with reports, is cloning, even if it's your own reports. But the key is that you are going to be creating your own copy of something that you own and that you have the ability to work with. The process of cloning is relatively straightforward. So if I wanted to work with this count of circulations template that I found, I just need to right click on it and choose clone template. And this will bring up this interface here. It says clone at the top, so I know what I'm doing. And I just have to do a couple of things in order to complete the cloning process. So over here on the right in this folder section, I need to choose where I want to save it. So this is why we had to create those folders before we could do anything, because that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at the folders that we own on our account. So I'm going to come down here to the webinar folder that I created earlier, and I'm going to click on that. And that list will collapse after you select your folder. So if you see the list expanded, it usually means that a folder has not been selected. If you see it collapse, then it does mean something has been selected usually. You can confirm that something has been selected and that it's what you wanted. Up here underneath the folder header, you'll see the name of the folder you've selected. Now I can also change the name. So for example, I could come over here. One thing that I usually do is I remove this clone identifier and I put in a version number. And the reason I do that is because typically speaking, when I'm working with a report, the first one is not going to end up being the one that I like. And so if it's a case where I'm cloning something, it may be that I clone it to test it and make sure it works. And once I've determined it works, then I decide, well, I don't need this particular display field, or I want to make sure that I'm adding this display field or something like that. And so I may create version 1.2 that makes those changes. Even if you don't think you're likely to create another version, I do recommend adding version numbers, because if you find that something doesn't work properly and you need to kind of go back in and tinker with it, typically it's easier to just change that version number at the end than it is to create a whole new title every time. But again, that's up to how you work and how you want to think about it. But it's definitely my advice for that. And just so that people who are new to reports and are maybe a little bit reticent, I often get up to like version 1.7, 1.8. I've gotten up to version 3.27 before. So you can make a lot of versions. It's very possible that you continue to need to tinker, or you continue to find that the report just really isn't working, that the data is not getting you what you're looking for. And that's okay. I often tell people that the best way to learn reports is to do reports. So running lots and lots of different versions is okay. You're not going to break the reporter. In fact, one of the things that I often do if I'm working with something that's maybe a little bit more complicated or a little bit outside my typical comfort zone in reports, I don't try to do everything at once. If I know that I want to make 5 or 6 changes, I do version 1 and I make the first change. I make sure that works. And then I come back in and I clone it and I do version 2 and I make my second change. And I go through incrementally, because that way, if something does fail, I know which specific thing failed. So again, that's just some insight into kind of how I work with reports. It may or may not be helpful for you, but at the very least, hopefully it makes you feel better that if reports don't come easily to you, you are not alone in needing to make multiple versions. So at this point, when cloning, this is all I need to do. I've saved the folder where I'm going to save the template, and I've done any changes to the name that I wanted to make. So I can just click save. I don't have to make any other changes, and I now have a copy of this report. I get this little indicator that it was saved successfully. And if I go into my webinar folder here, I'll see that I now have something here, whereas earlier it was empty. And of course, because I saved that column for template ID, when I come into this folder, I see that column's already there. So I have that ID number when I need it. So that is the first step to running any existing report, is to find what you're looking for and clone it. Now that you've done that, this is yours. This was originally in the shared folders under admin, which means that if I was looking at this particular report, back up here. So if I was looking at this particular report, I'd see that the owner of the original one that I got out of the centralized reports templates folder was admin. When I look at the one in my webinar folder here, the owner is admin TRN, which is me. So I've cloned it. This is now my copy and I own it on my account. So that's something that you want to make sure that you're doing every time. Any questions about the cloning process? All right, well, we are going to go ahead and talk next about what's happening under the hood. Now, I don't typically, in the past, when I've done reports training, I haven't gone into a lot of detail about this. But when I was putting together today's training, I realized that understanding a little bit about where the data is coming from and how the report is pulling that data might help people to understand when they're setting up a template, why certain things work and certain things don't. We're not going to go into deep detail here. You don't have to leave knowing how to do any kind of like SQL or anything like that. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit is the concept of relational databases, because that is what we're working with when we run reports. So for those of you who are not familiar with this concept, a relational database organizes data into structured, interconnected tables of rows and columns. Now, even if you've never heard the term relational databases before, my guess is that working in a library, you've come across something where there is data structured in rows and columns. Typically, it's probably in a spreadsheet. So one of the best ways that you can kind of think about the data that you're working with is that it's being saved in Evergreen in a whole bunch of spreadsheets. The thing that makes it relational is that those spreadsheets are connected to one another. And the way that they're connected is by a specific data field in each table. So for example, every time something happens in Evergreen, whether you are creating a new patron account or cataloging an item or checking an item out to a patron, every time you conduct any kind of transaction in Evergreen, data is added to the database. You get a new row in one of those spreadsheets. So if you're checking an item out to a patron, you are creating a new row in the circulation table. And one of the columns in that row is for the item that you've just checked out. So the special unique item ID number of that item you checked out shows up in the circulation table. What the reporter does is it uses that identifier to be able to link into the table where all the information about the item is stored. So in the circulation table, you don't have information like the circ modifier of the item or even the barcode of the item. All you have is that little unique identifier. The reporter uses that identifier to get you all the rest of that information. So if you want the barcode, if you want the circ modifier, if you want the shelving location, that identifier from the circulation table is what allows the reporter to pull the rest of that data in. So looking at kind of an under the hood look here at how things are stored, at the item table, there's a column for item ID number. In the circulation column, there is circulation table, there's a column for item ID number. And so in the item table, I've got the barcode and the library where the item is set to circulate. In the circulation table, I've got an identifier for that circulation transaction. I've got a timestamp for when it started. I have a whole lot more columns in both of these tables besides what I'm showing you here. But it's this that links together. So again, you don't really need to deeply understand any of this, but it's important, I think, when you're talking about display field and filters and things like that to understand how that stuff is being pulled from the reporter. So if you run a circulation report and you want to include details about the item that circulated, like the barcode, then basically the reporter is going to pull data from two different tables, from the circulation table as well as the item table. And it's going to make sure that the item that it's including information about is connected to the correct circulation transaction by connecting that item ID number. Now, the item ID number is not the barcode, because barcodes can be reused. If you delete an item, you can put a new item into the catalog that utilizes the same barcode. So Evergreen actually assigns a unique number. You don't really need to know that. There's never really any reason to know that unique number, but I'll show you where you can find it just in case you're curious. So if I come in to an item record, so I'm looking at an item record here. Up here in the URL, this string of numbers here, that's the unique item ID that would be used to link those two tables together. So never really any need for you to know that, but it took me a while to figure out that's what that was. So I am just sharing that information with you. So that is just kind of my very brief overview about what's happening when you run a report. Essentially, every time something happens in Evergreen, a row is added to a table somewhere in the database, that underlying set of data that is stored to make Evergreen functional. In order to get that data out of the database, you run reports. And in order to get data from multiple different tables, you use those linking unique item or ID numbers. You don't need to know the ID numbers. You don't even really need to know which fields are being linked. Evergreen does that work for you, but it's helpful, I think, to understand this concept of how the things are linked together, because as you get a little bit more advanced with reports, you'll start to be pulling things from different tables. And so understanding how they're connected can help you to figure out the best and most efficient way to find those tables. But that's all I'm going to say about that for today. Any questions about that before we move on? Right. Well, if you do have questions about this or anything else we've talked about up to this point, please feel free to put them in chat. We can always circle back to them. And we will be kind of touching on some of these concepts again as we move forward. But at this point, what we've done is we have learned how to navigate. We have learned how to find existing templates that we want to work with and how to clone those templates. So our next step really is to figure out how to run a report. But before we do that, I do want to talk very briefly about the concept of display fields and filters, because we don't have to do a whole lot of setup for that when we're cloning templates. But when we run the report, we do have to define some of our filters. So before we do that, I just want to give everybody sort of a foundational look at what those things are. So the display fields and filters are essentially your columns and rows. So display fields equal columns. So when you think about that spreadsheet, your data is broken up into different categories, and those categories are your columns. So you may have a column for barcode, you may have a column for shelving location. Those are all set in the report itself in the template when you set up your display field. So when you're in the template itself, this is what you'll see. You'll see this field display order pane, and then you'll select which categories you'd like to put in here. When you run the report, those will show up this way. So top to bottom becomes left to right. So if we're looking at barcode is the top option here in our field display, and it's the leftmost column in our output. So one of the things that you can do, certainly with your Excel file after you've run the report, but also to a certain extent within the template itself, is determine which order you'd like things to show up in. That's not quite as important as just understanding That's what a display field is going to be. It's going to be the column in your spreadsheet. There are several different data types that you may run into when choosing those display fields. The ones that you'll see are Boolean, which is just sort of your true or false option. So for example, is holdable would be a Boolean display data field. So when you have an item and you catalog that item, you have to determine whether or not that item can be placed on hold. In the database, that is stored as a true or false option. Either true, it can be placed on hold, or false, it cannot. The ID, that's that unique number that we talked about. An integer data type is just, it's a digit. These are actually fairly rare. There's not a whole lot that's saved as digits. One example I can think of is like the number of renewals remaining on a specific circulation transaction, but they're pretty rare. You don't see a lot of integers. An interval is an interval of time. So it might be 2 weeks or 6 months. This is what you'll see with things like circulation durations. A link, this is that ID that creates a link between tables. So if you have, for example, you're looking in the circulation table in your reporter, and you see that one of the display fields options is a link, then that means that you can use that to link to another table. And I'll show you really briefly what that looks like. All right, so if I am in my template and I'm coming down here and I'm looking at my display fields, you can see that I'm working from the circulation table. Over here in my display fields, let's look for one that's a good one. The circulating item is a link. If I include this as my basically one of the columns in my spreadsheet as one of my display fields, I'm just going to get that unique identifier. That's not really what I want. I don't want that. I don't want this number. It doesn't have a lot of meaning to me. Instead, what I want is to understand that it's going to use this piece of data to link to another table. So the name of it is circulating item. So I'm going to look over here to the left for a table named circulating item. I find it, and then I have all of this data about the item itself that I can include. So something to just be aware of is if you see this little parenthetical of link, that means this is a place where you can bring in another table. Money is a data type that is just a monetary amount. This is what you'll see with like billing and table or billing and payment reports. Org unit, that is your library. So it can be either your branch or your system. It is a unique 3-digit ID number. It is not the name of your library. So whenever you see org unit as a display field, you want to treat that like a link, and you want to find a different table to get data from. Otherwise, you're just going to get a 3-digit number, and I'll show you how to do that. Text, this is very standard. It's just any alphanumeric entry. So it's everything from a book's title to a patron's last name to a barcode. Barcodes are actually saved as text. So text is probably the most common. And then timestamp. This is the exact date and time that a transaction occurred, down to the second, which means that if you choose a timestamp for something, you're not going to get that something happened on September 3rd. You're going to get that something happened on September 3rd at 5:38 p.m. and 23 seconds. We'll talk about what you can do to make that a little bit more readable. When you're working with data types, especially as you're just getting started, these are the 4 to be on the lookout for. If it's anything else, it's either a more advanced display field than you're likely to need, or you can just put it in as is and you don't have to worry about the data type. But if you see one of these 4, there's something you may want to do with it. An ID means that you should be aware that you're going to get a number, which may not be how you would mentally identify something. So a patron's ID number is not going to be the same as their barcode or their name or something like that. It's their unique identifier, which may or may not be meaningful. Link, what we talked about a moment ago, this is when you would want to link out to a different table to get more information that you want to include in your report. Org unit, that's your library. And this is going to be a 3-digit code. Typically, when you see org unit, you'd want to treat it like a link. And then timestamp. This is a really common one. It shows up in a lot of reports because a lot of our reports are run for the purposes of dates and understanding when things happened or what types of things happened at certain time periods. So most reports are going to have some sort of timestamp data. And there's a lot you can do with that data. So I'll show you a couple of things. Before we move on to the next thing, I just want to show you how to work with these two, the link and org unit. So if I am looking in my template and I'm in my circulation table, we've already looked at this idea that if you see the word link, it means that this is an opportunity to link out to another table. Now, if I did not do this, if I just put circulating item in as my display field, I would get this ID number here, and that's not what I want. If I want, for example, the item's barcode, I would look for the table name listed over here on the left that matches this field name. So circulating item, and then from here, I would choose probably barcode, but I could choose any number of different things. Now, org unit is very similar. Essentially, it's a link as well, but it's going to be specifically called out as org unit. So right here, we have checkout renewal library, and it's parenthetical here as org unit. When I see this, that tells me that in order to get the name of the library, I need to link to another table. So I see org unit. That means that I want to look for the table named checkout renewal library over here in my left-hand pane here. So checkout renewal library is right here. And I click on that, I open up this table, and from this table, I can include the name of the library. You don't always have to do this. There are some, some reports where you don't necessarily care that much about the name of the library. You just want to see when it's different. Some people have their libraries code memorized, so they may find it slightly more efficient to just go with the org unit code rather than linking out to get the name. I always put in the name because I have 0 org unit codes memorized. But so most people, I would recommend doing this. And if you look at our centralized reports templates, they're all going to do this. And there are a couple of kind of odd transit reports where you can't put names of 2 different libraries. You can't put in the same column for like sending and receiving library in the current iteration of the reporter. I think that'll be fixed in the upgrade, but for now, those reports are having to use org unit codes. But that's a very niche situation. So the org unit code is functionally very similar to these link data types. Now, when you're just cloning a report, you don't really need to know this stuff because you don't really need to add any display fields. But as you're getting a little bit more comfortable, you might decide that you want to add a display field to an existing template, and that's when this information becomes handy. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add a display field to our to the report that we cloned earlier, the multi-month circulation count report. So to do that, and I'll just actually take us a step back so we can do it all together. You'd come into the template folder where that template is saved. So this was the one that we cloned from that shared folder earlier, from the centralized reports templates earlier. I'm going to clone it again. So I'm going to just right click on it and choose clone template. And I'm going to come up here to my template name, and I'm going to change it from 1.1 clone to 1.2. And I'm going to choose webinar as my save folder. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to add a new display field. So currently I have display fields for circulating library. So this is the library where an item was checked out. Shelving location. So the shelving location for that item. Checkout date and count. So how many times an item was checked out at this library in this shelving location on this date. One thing that you'll notice is that underneath each of the display fields, you have this little path. This is telling you how the tables are linked. So you started at the circulation table. From there, you went to the checkout renewal library table. And from there, you actually expanded further and you found the circulating library. which actually, oh, I'm sorry, you didn't expand further. You went over here to the display field and you chose circulating library as your display field from the checkout renewal library. And in this case, you probably went with name and then changed that name. So these paths are very helpful because they allow you to kind of see how the tables are being linked. And that's useful as you're learning so that you can kind of see how you can do that in the future with future reports. Now, let's say I wanted to add circ modifier to this report so that I'm getting a list of a count of items by the library, the shelving location, the checkout date, and also essentially the type of material they are. So I can do that by coming to my circulation table and then coming down here to my circulating item table. And within circulating item, I can find circulation modifier. Now this one says link, and I made a very big deal before about how when you see this, you should always link to the next table. The one exception to that is circulation modifier, because the unique identifier, the code for circulation modifier, is also the name of the circulation modifier. The code for a book circ modifier is BOOK. So it is perfectly fine to use the link as your display field with this one and this one only, because the actual identifier is completely readable. So all I have to do to add it as a display field is to click this little checkbox here. And if I scroll down, I'll see that I've now added it to the bottom. Now, of course, we talked about the idea that top to bottom is going to equate to left to right in our spreadsheet. I don't want this to be after the count. I want the count to be my rightmost column. So I can just move circulation modifier up by clicking on this little arrow. And now it's going to move to the left of the count column in the spreadsheet. And I have now added a field. And so any of you who are working along with me on this have hopefully added a field as well. And you can go ahead and click save. And now you have 2 templates in your template folder. And this one, 1.2, has a new display field of circulation modifier. And we'll come back to that because we're going to run a report off of it in a minute. Before we do that, are there questions about display fields? All right, well, there's one more thing to be aware of, and that is your filters. And we won't go into a lot of detail about setting up filters. We'll mostly talk about that in the context of defining them. But basically, your filters define the conditions that rows must satisfy to be included in the results set. They basically tell Evergreen what data to include, because if you don't filter and you just create this, this report that we've been working on here, you're going to get a report of every single item that has ever circulated in the history of NC Cardinal. You'll get it as a count, but you'll get every single date. And that is not what you want. So what you most likely want is how many items circulated on at your branch and during a specific time period. So that's what you want to set with a filter. The filter allows you to determine which data points to actually include. Now, filters are technically a 2-step process. You have to set them up in the template and in the report. In the template, you simply choose which types of filters you want. You say that you want to filter on the branch where the transaction took place, and you want to filter on the date range where those data point or where those transactions took place. So you would basically, within the clone template, you would say, I want to filter on the checkout date, and I want to filter on the org unit or the library. This particular template actually has 2 different library filters. It has one for the owning library and one for the library where the transaction took place. So you're able to kind of say, I want to see everything from my system here, everything owned by my system, but that was specifically checked out in this particular branch, or something like that. Without these filters, you're going to get too much in your output. So the filters are a really important part of the report. But at this point, you can see that there's no values for this. So I know that I want to filter on checkout date and time, but I don't know which dates I actually want to include. I know I want to filter on the owning library and the checkout library, but I don't know which libraries those are. So that's where that second step comes in. In the report, you define the values. So that's where you actually say which libraries to include or which dates that you want to include. So it's a two-step process. You can do some of this at the template step. I generally don't recommend that. One of the few things that I do regularly do at the template step is if I'm doing any kind of item report and I don't want to include deleted items, I will generally add a filter for deleted items and go ahead and say deleted equals false at the template level. But that's really the only one where you're going to regularly see that the filter has been defined within the template. For the most part, your definitions are going to happen at the report level. And that's what we're going to do next. But before we do that, let's take a 5-minute break. If there are any questions, we can go ahead and answer those. But otherwise, let's take 5 minutes and then we'll come back and get ready to run some reports. All right, well, let's get back to it and talk about running reports. But before we do that, are there any questions? I know we have covered so much in the last hour and 20 minutes or so. And it's probably a little overwhelming for some of you, and that's understandable and fine. So if you do have questions, or if you're just generally confused and want to see something again, chances are somebody else is feeling the same way. And so don't be embarrassed to speak up and ask any questions that you may have. We've covered a lot, and I'm happy to go back and revisit anything. I think if there was a major takeaway from what we've covered so far, it's to clone your templates and make sure you have your folders set up before you do anything else. A lot of the other stuff is helpful, but those are the two things that are necessary. All right, well, let's go ahead and run a report off of the template that we have cloned. So at this point, for those of you who have been following along with me, you should have two different cloned templates available. One is the direct clone that we took from the centralized reports templates, and the other one is the one that, that we added a display field of circ modifier to. So at this point, in order to actually get output for those reports, we have to set them up to run. We've basically created the parameters that we want Evergreen to use when pulling data. Now we need to tell it to pull that data. So that's what this step is all about. Setting up a report to run. Basically, a couple of things about it. You can run multiple reports off of a single template. So I said earlier, if you were doing, for example, a weeding template, you could create one template and then you could run a different report for each shelving location in your library. And so that allows you to not necessarily have to overwhelm yourself with data and to work at a pace that is useful. It also allows you to run different reports at different times. So if you want a circulation report of everything that circulates throughout a week, you can just run that report every Monday for the past week, for the previous week, simply by rerunning a report off of the same template and changing the dates. When you are setting up a report to run, the main thing that you're doing is setting the parameters for your filters. So we set up the filters in the template. If you're cloning, those filters have already been created for you, but we need to define them. And so that's one of the biggest things that we're doing when we're setting up the report to run, is defining those filters. But we're also determining how we're going to get our output. When the report is going to run, you can have it run right away. You can also schedule it to run in the future. And as we'll talk about it in a few minutes, you can set it to run on a recurring regular basis. You can determine whether or not you'd like the output emailed to you. And you can also email it to multiple other people. So if you want a copy sent to you as well as your director, then you can set that up to happen. And then, of course, what does that output look like? Is it just the HTML that you can view directly in your browser? Is it an Excel file that you can download? There are also a couple of chart options. I don't recommend them generally. They are not, they only work with certain types of reports. So you may choose it only to find out after running that it didn't work. Furthermore, they're just not the prettiest charts when they do work. You'll probably, if you are at all good with Excel, if you're at all good with Excel, you can create better charts and graphs within Excel than what Evergreen is going to provide to you. But the biggest thing that you'll be selecting is whether or not it is an HTML output only or something that would be downloaded to your computer. We will talk about recurrence next. Let's go ahead and set up our first report to run. So I'm going to come back into my reporter. And I am going to choose my webinar folder. And we'll go ahead and run this second cloned report, the one that we added that circ modifier to. And to run a report, I can select it and I can come up here to the actions menu and choose new report, or I can just double click on it. If I double click, it's going to pull me right into the reports interface. And this is where I want to go to actually set up my report to run. Now within the reports interface, you have 3 different tabs. The first tab is the columns tab. So this is where those display fields are going to show up. You can't do anything to these at this point. So those are set in the template and they cannot be in any way manipulated from this point. But the columns tab does allow you to check them to make sure they're actually what you expect them to be. And so there may be a situation where you cloned a template and you can't remember what the fields are supposed to be, or this is a template you created 2 years ago and it's the first time you've come back to it and you don't remember what the fields are supposed to be. This allows you to come in and see what those fields are before you run it, just to make sure it's everything that you expect to find. You will be immediately taken into the filters tab when you get into the reports interface. So this second tab is actually where you'll start. And this is where you can define your filter. So this is where the real work of the report step happens. And so when we cloned this template, there were 3 different filters applied to it. So we're going to have to define all 3 of them. The first one is that we have to define the checkout date and time. Now, this is specifically set to show up as a month. So in order to do that, I can put in, I believe that's going to work. Just in case, I'm also going to define it this way. And we'll see which one of those works, because at the I forgot to write down the format that I needed to use for this. I apologize for that. But this is a great insight into some of the different ways you can test things on the fly with reports. So you'll first be setting your date filter. Your next filter is down here is the organizational unit ID. Now, one of the things you'll notice here is that your operator is not in list. What you're doing with this particular filter is you're determining where is you're looking for items that are not owned by a specific org unit. So you might do this for a number of different reasons. So you might do this primarily for resource sharing. So if you want to ensure that all of the items that are coming up in this particular circulation report are those that are not owned by your library, then this is how you can do that, because you're going to be setting 2 org units. The first one is who owns it. The second one is where it's checked out. So because the who owns it filter is a not filter, anything you choose here, Evergreen is going to pull up anything that is not in that. So if I were to choose pack as my not in list option, then I would get things that are owned by every other library in NC Cardinal, with the exception of Pack Memorial Library. For this particular report, I think the most useful thing to do is actually to choose all of the branches within the system that I'm looking at. So if I'm going to be looking at Buncombe, I would choose every branch in Buncombe for my not in list. So what I'm going to end up with is a list of circulations that happened on items brought in via resource sharing, items that were checked out at a Buncombe library, but are not owned by a Buncombe library. And so I've done the ownership part of it. Now I need to set the filter for the checkout part of it. So I'm going to come down here to the checkout renewal library filter, and I'm going to choose the exact same set of libraries, because these are the libraries where I want to see circulation data. So basically what I'm getting are items that were checked out in September of 2025 at any Buncombe County Public Library branch that are not owned by Buncombe County Public Library. So it's a little bit of it takes a second to wrap your head around what we're doing here. But it's a couple of different ways that you can utilize filters. Are there any questions about that setup? A couple of tips for working within the filters, particularly when you have something like this where you have these lists. So I can, with these carrots, I can expand or collapse the branches for a system. It is going to automatically expand the system where my workstation is. So I'm currently logged in at PAC in Buncombe. So that's why Buncombe was already expanded. Now I could collapse that and I could expand any other one of them that I wanted. But it's going to automatically expand for wherever I'm logged in. Another thing to be aware of is when I selected all of these, I did not just say, well, I want everything from Buncombe County, so I'm just going to select Buncombe County. The reason that you can't just do that, you can't just select at the system level, is that items are not owned by a system. Circulation transactions do not occur at systems. Patrons do not have a home library that is a system. All of that stuff happens at the branch level. So if I select the system for my filter, Evergreen's going to be looking at that org unit, the system org unit, and there won't be any data because there's no data that's connected to that org unit. You always have to choose the branch. So just be aware of that. There is a filter option up here at the top. So if I specifically was looking for, let's look for Nantahala. I can start typing that in and it's going to reduce the options that I see. So now I have Nantahala Regional Library, as well as the Nantahala Community Library branch of Fontana. So anything that has this in its name is going to show up. What I don't have is all of Nantahala Regional's other branches. All I have is their bookmobile, because that's the only one of their branches that has Nantahala in the name. So the filter is sort of useful, but unfortunately it over filters a little bit. So I can't put in the name of my system and get all of the branches that come up. I'm only going to get branches that have my filter in them. So just kind of a word of warning when working with that filter. I think that's it for looking at the filter definitions. So let's go on to our final step, unless there are any questions or anything anybody wants to take a look at in terms of filters. And one of the things that you will find when working with date options is that if you have selected a date filter that is just a date, so in this case, it's been turned into a month, but if it's just a date, you'll get a little calendar widget, and I'll show you that in a second while we wait for this to run. I'll show you a separate one. So you can actually use a calendar widget to find the dates that you need. I didn't realize that that wasn't going to come up here though. Okay, well, let's take a look at the layout and scheduling tab. So once we've set our filters, and like I said, that's kind of the main work of setting up the report to run. Our final step is to determine our layout and scheduling. So this is how we want to receive our output. So the first thing we're going to do is choose our output format. So it's going to automatically check CSV and HTML. HTML is browser-based, which means I'll basically get a link, and the link will allow me to look at the data directly in an Evergreen tab. That is really useful for a quick check to make sure that you actually have data, because sometimes you'll run a report and something will have been set wrong or some filter will be incorrectly applied and you won't get any results. And so having that HTML option is really useful because you can quickly look and glance and see that you're actually getting data and that the data is generally formatted the way you want. So I usually check this one. I do recommend, though, that you always also have a downloadable option, because that's where you're actually able to go in and work with that data. You know, the HTML version is very static. If I download it into Excel, then I can go in and sort and filter and print and do all kinds of things. If you are running a report for the purposes of re-uploading data into Evergreen, so for example, a list of barcodes for the item status screen, you'll want to download it as a CSV. In most other cases, Excel is probably a better choice. And a CSV can be easily converted into Excel when you open a CSV on your computer. depending on what software you have installed on your computer, it's almost always going to open up in Excel, and then you can just save it to Excel from there. So CSV, there's nothing wrong with doing that. It just may be an extra step at the save point after downloading. And then, of course, if you don't have Excel, then saving it as a CSV is a good choice. But I'm going to save it as HTML and Excel. So I do have these options I mentioned of the bar chart and the line chart. I do not recommend these. I'd recommend that if you do want charts, that you save it to Excel and then create your charts from within there. And then finally, over here, after choosing how we want our output, we need to choose where that output's going to be saved. So we actually are choosing two things here. We're choosing where this report that we're running right now is saved. So we're going to choose that webinar folder that we created earlier today. And then the same thing with our outputs. Where is that output going to be saved once the report has run? Again, I'll choose the webinar folder from earlier today. So now we know what we're getting and we know where it's going. Now we need to determine when it's going to do that. So we'll talk about recurrence in a second. Let's talk about just a single option of a report for now. So when scheduling a report, I can have it go immediately, and as soon as I save it, it's going to start running. Or I can schedule it to run at some point in the future. So I could say I'd like this to run first thing Monday morning, for example. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and run it now. But this is really useful with those reports that are, sort of monthly statistical reports and things like that. A lot of times you'll set those up as recurring reports, but if you don't want to do that, if you want to be able to kind of have that full control each time, then you can schedule those to run, the next day. Or if you wanted to have something run at the end of the day and you'll be leaving before the library actually closes, you can have it run, 10 minutes after library closing, and then it'll be ready for you the next morning. I'll go ahead and run it now. And now I need to choose where I'd like to get it. Now, if I leave this blank, I can still get the output because it's going to be saved to my Evergreen account. So all I have to do is go into that output folder where I've saved it, the one that I selected over here. But most people do like to get this as an email, and I do recommend putting your email address in here simply because if you do have any problems with the report, you can forward the output email that you got to a member of the Cardinal team, and we can take a look at it. And that's an easy way to share information about what happened with the report. So I do recommend getting it emailed regardless of how you're going to end up accessing it. So I'll go ahead and email it to myself. Now, if you wanted to email it to multiple people, you can just put in a comma, and then you can put in the email addresses of the other people you'd like to email it to. So that could be your director, it could be people in your county government, it could just be other colleagues in your library. And you can do as many people as you'd like. I have not found a limit to this yet. So I don't think I've ever done more than maybe 4 or 5, but still, I have not yet found a limit. And once you've done all this, you've chosen your output, you've chosen where it'll be saved, you've chosen when it will run, and who it will be emailed to. You click Save and Schedule, and you get this little indicator that it was saved successfully. And so now it's running. Now I can watch the progress of it running by coming here to my Outputs folder and going into the webinar folder where I've saved the output. And I can see that it is still in the process of running. And I can see that because it's in this pending section. So your output folder is divided into 2 sections. You have pending at the top and complete at the bottom. At the top here under pending, this is anything that's currently running or scheduled to run in the future. So if you scheduled something to run next Monday, it's going to show up here in pending until that date comes and it runs and completes. If you have a recurring report, the next recurrence will always show up in pending, which means that, if I have a recurring report that runs the 25th of every month at 11 a.m., then prior to 11 a.m. today, this month's report will be showing up as pending. After 11 a.m. today, this month's report would be complete, and next month's report would show up as pending. So you're always going to see the next one coming. You don't see a list of all the future ones, just the next one that'll be here.
one word of warning with that. And when we talk about recurrence, we can look at this in actual practice. But if you do have a recurring report and you see it in pending and you delete it, it will not just delete that one, it will then no longer run. So if you do delete a pending recurring report, you will have to reset up your recurrence. We'll talk about that again when we do recurring in a minute. If you are like me and you are sitting here watching your report, waiting and waiting for it to be done, you can click this refresh grids button as many times as you need to see it move from pending to complete. So I can do that. I'm not going to do that. We're going to move on and talk about some other things, and then we'll come back and check on this later. Any questions about that report setup? Well, let's go ahead and talk about recurrence. So a recurring report is functionally the same as a regular report in all ways, except that you set it to run on a regular cycle. The only thing to be aware of is that if it is a date-based report in any way, you do have to make a slight change to the dates in order to make it work for a recurring report. So the biggest thing is that you have to change your dates to something called relative dates. In order to do that, the date must be transformed into an official date. So I said earlier that when you add a date as a display field, it's adding it as a timestamp, and that timestamp is down to a second. Timestamps will not work in recurring reports, so you will have to change those into dates. Additionally, that month filter that we had on the report we just ran, that also won't recur. So if I set that to be September 2025 and I set that report to run monthly, it's going to run every month, but it's going to give me the same data every month, because every month it's just going to give me September 2025. The only way that I can get those dates to change each time the report runs is to set the filter as a date and make that date relative. And I will show you how to do that in just a moment. You do need to make sure you're doing a scheduled runtime. Now you can set a report to recur and run right away. So with the report we've just done, we set it to run immediately. We could have done that and still had it recur, and then it would have run, you know, depending on the recurrent cycle we set up, it would have run next month, October 25th at 3:40 p.m. and then November 25th at 3:40 p.m. and on until we stopped it. Typically I wouldn't recommend doing that way. Typically I would recommend scheduling it for when you want it to run, especially if it is date-based. If you are looking for like a circulation report that you want to run monthly and you want it to cover all of the circulation transactions for the previous month, you want it to run on the first of the next month. So if I want all of my September circulation data, I'd want to set that to run October 1st. And then recurrence would have it run next on November 1st and December 1st. Unfortunately, you can't have it run on the last day of the month, because that day will change from month to month. You know, if I set it up this month for the last day of the month, it'd be the 30th. It would run again October 30th, which means it would leave off October 31st transactions. So you can't do it that way. And I think I've tested it in the past where if you set it up to always be the 31st, as soon as you get to a month with only 30 days, that it simply won't go. And as a result, you'll have to reset up your recurrence, because it'll basically be a non-existent report at that point, and it won't know how to recur from there. So if you have a monthly report, always set it up to run the first of the month. And you can have it run at 2 a.m. on the first of the month, so you don't have to worry that any transactions from the next month are slipping through, but always make it for the first of the month. And then you can set up recurring reports to be emailed to people and to multiple people. So you can determine who you'd like to have it receive it. If in the future you want to change who receives that, that is possible. And I will show you that once we have a recurring report set up. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing I'm going to do to set up a recurring report is take this circulation report we've been working with and change the date filter within the template so that I can make it a relative date. So I have to, in order to do that, I have to come back up here to my template folder. And I'll come in here to this one that I've created, 1.2, and I will clone it. And this is going to be 1.3. I'm going to save it to the same place, to webinar. And I'm not going to make any changes here to my display field. We've already added the display field we wanted to. Instead, I'm going to come into my filters tab. And within the filters tab, I can see the filters that I already have set. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this checkout date and time filter. And this first column here is called transform. The transform is how basically the reporter transforms your data to make it readable in the output. The default transform for all data is raw data. And in most cases, that's all you need. So if you look down here at our org unit filters, they are both set to raw data. If we look in our display fields, most of these are set to raw data as well. But for this date one, we don't want raw data because that would be a timestamp. That is the way that that data is stored in the database. So instead, we want to change it to a date. So the timestamp would give us down to the second. We just want it to be day, month, and year. So I'm going to change this transform to date. And then, because I want this to be a monthly report, I'm going to change this over here from equals to between. So what that's going to allow me to do is set a start date and an end date. So I can do that by simply choosing this between thing. This is what we call an operator. Now, we're not going to set our filter values at this point, but I do want to show you how you could do that if you wanted to, though, as I said earlier, I don't recommend usually doing that. If I click this checkbox here that says supply filter value, I can go ahead and set this up the way that I would at the reports step. So I could go ahead and set my start and end point for this report here. I'm not going to do that because then it would always be set this way and I'd have to come back to the template level every time I wanted to run the report. So I'm going to remove this, but that is where you can do that. So I've changed my filter and I'm going to click save. And my template has saved successfully. If I come back into that webinar folder, I'm going to come down here to 1.3 and I'm going to double click to run my report. So again, I've been put directly into the filters tab of the report setup. And now you can see I have, as my checkout date and time, I have these two little fields that I can fill in. So before I had sort of a free text field where I had to put in the value for the month I was looking for. Now I have one date field for the start and one for the end. And as I said earlier, I now have a little calendar widget. So I could choose from the calendar what those dates are. But since this is going to be a recurring report, I actually want these to be what we call relative time values, where I'm going to set a range of from 30 days ago to 1 day ago. Now, this is not going to, we won't see the actual output of this because I'm going to schedule it to run ahead. You do have the ability to put this up pretty high. So I could put this up to, 365 days ago and get a full year's worth of data. There are some other things you can do when you're setting up your date operator. So we chose between. If we hadn't chosen between, we actually would have some ability to do things like choose months instead of days or something like that. I'm going to set up my org unit ID filters the same way I did last time. We're not in list, meaning not owned by any branch in Buncombe. And then the checkout renewal library would be every branch in Buncombe. And so this is going to give me basically the same thing that I set up in my last version of the report, but it will allow me to rerun this report monthly without having to do anything. And that's really the idea behind Recurrence. I'm going to once again choose Excel. I'm not going to bother with HTML though, because I just want to get that email and, make sure that it is what I'm looking for each month. I will save it to the same spot. There are some people who have sort of one folder for recurring reports and another for one-off reports. So if that works for you as an organizational method, definitely some people have a lot of use with that. I don't run a lot of recurring reports, so I don't need to do that. And then I'm going to come down here to Recurrence, and I check this box. And then what I do is I say how often I want it to recur. Now I could choose 30 days, but then we're going to run into that issue with month links. So instead I'm going to change this to months, and I'm going to have it recur every month. I could run it now, but then it's going to recur every month on the 25th at 3:50 p.m., which is not what I want. And so instead I'm going to have it run on October 1st. And we'll set it to 4 a.m. And then I'll go ahead and put in my email address, and then I would save and schedule. And my report was saved successfully. So let's come back into our output folder. And we can see that I'm still waiting for that first one to run. Must be bigger than I realized. So that one's still kind of going. But this is actually the one that I wanted to talk about briefly, because this is the recurring one that we just ran. So this is going to stay here in pending until October 1st. And then when I come in at 7:30 on October 1st, I'll see it show up down here in complete. And up here in pending, I'll see the next month's, which will be scheduled to run on November 1st. So you can see the scheduled runtime here is October 1st. Once October 1st passes, then I'll see something else here for November 1st. And that will keep going until I stop this. In order to stop it, the easiest way is actually to come into this pending section, select it, and delete it. But as I said earlier, if you do that, it does mean that it will stop the recurrence. It won't simply delete the next month's recurrence. It will no longer recur after that. You also have the option, and we have not spent any time in this reports level folder, but if I come into reports and I come into webinar and I come to the recurring one, you can see that it says yes under recurring. I can also delete it from here. So I can delete the pending output, and that will actually retain the report. So if I wanted to come back at any point to see how I had set that up in the past, so I could repeat it in the future, then I still have this report saved. Whereas if I delete it from reports, then I'm going to delete any pending output. I'm also going to delete the report that I'd set up. So generally, I would recommend with anything that you may need again, and you're just trying to stop recurrence, to delete it from pending. But if it's something that's just not working for you and you don't want anymore in any shape, you can delete it from here, from the reports folder. So I'll go ahead and do that. Now, while we're in this folder, I will show you one other thing that you can do. So if I come into this other non-recurring report that we set up, I can double click on it, and it's going to show me any output, whether complete or pending. Additionally, I can come up here to the action menu, and I can choose edit report. Now, I can't edit the report that's running right now, but I can set new filters and then come into my layout and scheduling. So for example, I could get rid of September, and I could put in October, and then come into layout and scheduling. It's saved already to the same folder it's been in. And then I save my output, and then I schedule it to run on October 31st. And then that's going to basically recur then. So this is sort of a manual option for getting the same report for getting reports to run multiple times without using recurrence. So if you don't need that sort of consistent schedule time that you might want with like your monthly circulation reports, but just a report that you know you're going to run somewhat regularly, then this is the way that you can do that. You can save it and schedule it. And so our original one is still here. It's still pending. It's still here. It's still pending. So that first version of it is still going to run, but now there's a new version of it that is been edited and is going to run now. So that is recurrence. Are there any questions about that? We have about 5 minutes left, so we can talk a little bit about troubleshooting or answer any questions at that point. But if anybody has specific questions about recurrence. Well, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about troubleshooting. Just a couple common issues to be aware of, and we've touched on a few of these. One of the big things is choosing the system instead of branches. So when we set up a filter for our org units, I made sure to choose the branches. If you choose the system instead, you're going to get blank output. So if you ever do get blank output, that would be the first thing I would check, is whether or not you chose a system rather than a branch level for org unit filters. One thing that does happen, and it actually doesn't happen as often as I would expect it to, but it does come up occasionally, is that somebody will choose essentially a linked field. So we looked at, when we were setting up templates, we looked at those data types that had the word link next to them, and we realized that that meant I needed to look at the next table. Sometimes somebody will put that in as a display field rather than going to the table and getting a name or a label. And so they end up with that sort of ID number, which isn't very useful in a report. So something to just keep an eye out for. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about transforming timestamps. One thing that can cause problems with, certainly with recurrence, because you're unable to set relative dates in that case, but also when you are doing a count report, if you want a count of things that happen on a specific date and you fail to transform that field from a timestamp to a date, then you're going to get just a list of counts of one, because it will be things that happened at each second of the day. So if your filter is supposed to give you a full month of circulation transactions and a count of how many transactions occurred per day, you're actually going to get a count of how many transactions occurred per second. So anytime you have a count report, you definitely want to make sure that you're transforming that date field from a timestamp into either a date or some other type of specific time frame, because a timestamp is just is too precise to be useful in a count report. So those are some of the issues that are very easy to recognize and fix. There are also, there are lots of very common issues that come up with reports that take a little bit more time to understand why they're happening. And in those cases, if you have something outside of this, don't hesitate to put in a ticket. If you have something inside of this, but you're still just not sure, go ahead and put in a ticket for that as well. But these are some that are kind of quick checks. So if you get a totally blank report, make sure you've chosen branches rather than systems. If you get a report where a column is just a bunch of numbers that don't mean anything to you, check to make sure that that wasn't that wasn't a link data type. And if it was, figure out what to link to. And if you get a count report that's just a list of ones, check the date field for it, the column for the date, and see if it's giving you down to the second information. One last thing when we're talking about troubleshooting is that if you do get a report that fails for whatever reason, whether it is an absolute failure, it's an error message, or it is just the data doesn't make sense to you. You get it and it says that you only created 3 library cards last month and you know you did 15 yesterday. Then the best thing you can do is put in a ticket and send us the debugging information. So the debugging details are basically a specialized SQL query that we can use to go into the database and figure out what Evergreen thinks it's trying to pull and how that compares with what data you're asking for. It also gives us some information about how to find the template you created and what data is included in that template. This is not super readable. It's okay that if you can't read it. But I will show you what it looks like. The most important thing is that you just send it to the NC Cardinal staff. And I will show you some debugging data real quick. So when you go into an output folder, and you open up the HTML, you can click this to say back to output index and click on debugging info. And this is what you'll see that you can send to us. And so, like I said, it's not readable. It's not something that you're likely to make a lot of sense of just looking at it, but we can take this and then put it into the database and use that to figure out what's going on. So this is really useful for us to troubleshoot for you. And with that, I've come to the end of what I had to talk about. I hope I haven't overwhelmed people too much. I know reports are a little bit overwhelming. They have a very steep learning curve. The most important thing you can do when trying to learn reports is just try running reports. Go into those centralized reports templates, clone them, run them, see what happens. It's a lot. As Benjamin says in the chat, reports are a lot. And my hope is that throughout the year, we will build on this. So, even if you've never run a report before, and this is your first training in it, what I'd recommend you do is practice and see what you come up with. Send in questions as you find them. Join the reports Basecamp group. And then the next time we have reports training, come to that one as well, because each time we'll build a little bit on what we talked about today. We'll add a little bit to it. We'll revisit things. Good. I'm really glad that it's been helpful. I know it's, that is exactly how I'm feeling when I talk about reports for a long time. Is we got it, we covered it. And hopefully some stuff sank in. I think your key takeaways are just clone things in order to run them and make sure you have folders set up to save things to. And from there, anytime something doesn't work right, let us know and we'll walk you through what may have gone wrong. Maria, I'm really glad that you got something from this. I know you're a reports expert, so it's always good to know that there's still some things that some new things. There's always a mystery in reports that we find. Yep. As Benjamin says, practice, try things, ask questions. That's the best way to learn anything. Definitely the best way to learn reports. You won't break anything. You won't break Evergreen if you run a report that doesn't work. You won't stop other people from doing things. There's a timeout thing. So if you run a report that's circular and would just run forever, Evergreen will stop it. So you don't have to worry that would actually happen. Evergreen will stop it and time it out. And that is literally the worst thing you can do if you run a bad report, is run something that takes a while and eventually that'll stop too. So don't be scared. Thanks for being here, and send me questions as you come up with them. And I will see you at the next one, I hope.